Hey folks, my name's Kevin, and it is finally time for some more knife nerdery. It has been a while. It's been a month and a half since I've posted anything. It's been 2 months since I've filmed anything. And the really short version is that my personal and professional life both got real crazy real quick, and this had to take a break. The big thing for folks that already know me, they already know this. I moved. It was a really long, complicated move. And so it took a really long time just for me to get all of this set back up. My editing rig down there, my camera lights up here, my camera mount up here, all of this kind of fun stuff. I am so excited to be back, though. I'm finally filming again. Okay, let's cut to this. Right, today we're going to be talking about the Qvist Bladeworks Variant P.E, the production edition of the Variant knife from Jacob Lundquist. And we're going to be talking about the full evolution. From the fact that I have all of these on the table, you can probably surmise the fact that I really like this knife. So huge thank you to Jacob for letting me check out these two, because these two are both prototypes. This is the new Qvist Bladeworks Variant P.E 3, and this is technically not a variant. This is just a knife inspired by the same lines as the variant, but a smaller fifth pocket slip joint called the Vanish. I'm going to be talking all about the evolution of these, and then this one today. And then in another video, I'm actually going to do a whole blade swapperoo. I'm not going to include that in this because it doesn't take forever, but I'm actually going to take this version. So this is a Sagaiha wave pattern version that I got. It was an exclusive to Urban EDC Supply. Shout out to them, and shameless plug. Feel free to use my referral link there if you want to help out the channel. But anyway, this is a version. All of the PE knives here on this table are made by Qvist, but this milling pattern here, I'm 90% sure, was done by Jacob himself and his little mini mill that he used to use, or still is using, I guess, to make the custom versions of the variant. Anyway, I got this version and it's got black literally everything except for the scales. So I thought it'd be fun to make a truly fully blacked out version. And so I'm going to put these scales on this blade setup, and then these scales on this blade setup, and then this scale on that blade and that scale on that. And I'm going to do a whole shuffling. But anyway, we'll do that in another video. Let's clear some space. Oh, and quick interjection, I don't know when this is going to be available for sale. Jacob said he was hoping to do a drop rather than a pre-order, but the Vanish, there is a Kickstarter going on right now and a pre-sale on his website, and that Kickstarter ends on December 2nd, so don't miss that. Okay, let's talk about this evolution. Now, let's talk about this evolution. When the prototype of the PE2 came out, I already made a video comparing the PE1 to the PE2. These are largely the same knife with some quality of life improvements, but the big difference between them is that this blade spine has been extended upward. Some jimping has been added onto it to make it into now a front flipper as well. Now, these are both still definitely primarily middle finger flicker knives, but it is really nice to have that additional opening mechanism, especially if you're someone that likes to fidget. Moving back, the other big difference between these two is that the lock bar has been extended outward slightly. It's not that there's more recession on this side, it's that the lock bar itself is extended outward to give you slightly better lock bar access. Otherwise, we have the exact same 14C28N blade steel, and what we've gone from is a satin finish, which is fine, to a stonewash finish that I much prefer. Now, I mentioned that I was moving, and this is the knife that I had out. And so this is the knife that I use for almost all of my moving tasks, which is mostly breaking down boxes and generally kind of cutting things that have been wrapped up. And so I definitely use the heck out of this knife. But one of the things that happens with a blade finish like this is you start to just see kind of scratches and wear. Can you see right there? Yeah. And there's a... Can I get it to catch the light right there? Okay. And these kinds of scratches would have been completely hidden if this is the one that I had on me. But anyway, workhorse knife, loved it. Otherwise, these knives look basically the same. And when I open this up, the PE3, you might at first glance say, hey, that looks the same as the others. But watch what happens when I now flip them over. Yeah, we have now gone from a liner lock to a full titanium frame lock. These earlier versions have full stainless steel liners. And so even if you got the titanium scales that they released with the PE2 and put them on, they'll fit the PE1 as well. You still will have that full steel liner inside. But over here, we've got full slabs of titanium on both sides, and it has now been converted into a frame lock. And that is just so freaking cool. Ooh. Now, I don't know if you heard that, but it makes a different sound, in part because the full tie slabs here, but also because there's been a really significant change to this blade. Now, let's switch over and talk about those blades. In general, we have the exact same blade profile from this dimension. It's the same, just a hair shy, 2.995, some kind of thing like that, basically 3-inch long blade, and in the same kind of stonewash finish across these two. But we've gone from 14C28N, which is everyone's favorite budget steel these days, to 20CV, which is, the kind of modern de facto super steel. So that's a really, really nice improvement to see, going from a budget steel up to a premium steel range. But the bigger thing, the thing that got me really, really excited, is these two are full flat grinds. And the big difference between them is that they slightly thinned it out here, so it comes to a slightly more aggressive taper and slightly thinner behind the edge. But this is now a wicked, wicked thin hollow grind. Ooh, look at that. Oh my gosh, I love it. And so this was the thing that made a nerd like me so freaking excited, because it meant that I finally got to experience something I've literally never experienced before, which is a true side-by-side cut test of a flat grind versus a hollow grind with no other variables changing. Now, I've cut with a lot of hollow ground knives, I've cut with a lot of flat ground knives, and generally speaking, there's always something else going on. There's some, because they're different knives, there's some thickness difference in the blade stock, or there's some height of the grind variance, or something else that would change how it would cut anyway. But with this, I actually got to experience what happens when you take the exact same blade, and just go from a flat grind to a hollow. And I was expecting it to be different, but it was quite different. Let's start talking about why and what's going on. Now, I said that they thinned these out coming from the PE1 to the PE2. They both have the exact same 0.12-ish blade stock. This one is 0.122 and this is 0.199, but those are nearly identical, both basically 120 thousandths. This one comes down to 22 thousandths behind the edge, and this one comes down to 16 thousandths behind the edge. And so what we have here is just a more acute thin tip. Let's see if I can get this to focus. I don't know, it's kind of subtle, but can you tell that the one on the left is just thicker than the one on the right? What that means is that it's going to enter into materials slightly worse. And in my cutting experience, I had a lot of cardboard to test this with. In my cutting experience, this does indeed enter cuts slightly worse. This is just a little bit more of that kind of butter sinking in feeling. But what it really does come, where you do start to notice it, is when you're trying to work with these tips. This one is just a little bit more of a wedge, and you can get into a little bit more of an acute space here. And when you start trying to do intricate cuts to kind of like cut out an intricate shape on a flat surface, you really do just have more nimbleness here, especially if you're cutting into something like cardboard where there's some thickness to it, because that I know it looks subtle, but that extra thinness just makes this a lot more maneuverable. But then when we come over here, oh my gosh. So this is the thinner version, and look at what we come down to on that. We've come from 16 thousandths to now 11 thousandths behind the edge. Compare that back over here to the original. Make sure I don't cut myself. And oh my gosh, it is such a difference here. Let me get some, yeah. So this was always a good slicer, and this is a freaking laser beam. So I did a whole bunch of cardboard cut testing with this. Now, I wasn't trying to do the kind of thing to see how long the edge will last or how well this 20CV will hold up or something like that. So this is not a sisal rope cut testing. What I did is I broke down 3 boxes of varying different cardboard types and cut them into thin strips and tried to do those kind of intricate cuts like I talked about. There is a noticeable difference between these two, but it's relatively subtle. This is already a slicing knife because this is a 0.95 inch grind, which means that that's a pretty darn tall, nearly full flat grind on a thin stock. So this is already a slicing knife. This is just slightly more that butter sink in feel, like where it just kind of feels like there's no resistance. But oh my God, this was night and day. This just glides in. And if you're cutting something like regular cardboard, regular like Amazon box cardboard, this has so little resistance, it's insane. And when you're working up here with this exceptionally thin tip, this is so maneuverable. Cutting like squirrely lines through something or trying to trace something, it is so easy with this. This is such an exceptional, intricate utility slicer. Now, where things kind of started breaking down in terms of differences is if I was cutting something very thick. Now, I have some ultra heavy duty double walled cardboard box that I was using for dishes. in my move. So it's not just double walled, it's extra stiff on top of that. And at that point, when you get to midway through the cut, the biggest thing that's going to impact there is how much the material is able to splay. And a material like that just will not splay to the side. It will not want to shift because it's so thick and so rigid. And at that point, the biggest thing is going to be how much you're trying to push it out. And so the blade stock thickness there is going to be the biggest thing whether or not it wedges. And so since the height of the grind and the thickness of the blade stock there, these move through the middle of a really dense material like that about the same. But even on that material, entering into it is so much easier with this one because this just stays so thin for so long. So we went from a knife that was like an excellent slicer and I absolutely loved cutting with it, to an exceptional slicer and I loved cutting with it, to an oh my god slicer, and it is so fun to cut with this. I absolutely love it. Now, I personally tend to prefer liner locks to frame locks, just a personal preference. And so I was kind of curious whether or not I would potentially be able to swap this blade back down. I haven't tried, but I don't think I would be able to, because if you look at where that comes, if I hold these handles up exactly, the actual lock face on the PE3 is just slightly in front and definitely at a different angle than on the PE2, which means I don't think these would be interchangeable. But when I eventually get one of these, because I'm definitely going to get one of these, I will probably just try and see if I can do that, mostly just because I'm curious. Otherwise, these blades are very, very similar. We have got the exact same profile, like I said, the exact same kind of sharpening choil. We're talking about like the plunge grind here, the thing that takes from the full thickness to the thinnest behind the edge. On all of these, it ends at the very, very top of this choil, which is exactly what you want to see. Now, on all of these, the choil itself is not very deep. So as you sharpen this up and this gets shorter and shorter and shorter, eventually you will hit the same line as this, but you're never going to be going up onto that and creating that smile the same way. And that's the same over here on the PE3, so nothing has really changed. It's all of the same virtues that I've said in my previous videos on that. Now, another subtle difference that I want to point out is on the original PE, we've got a chamfer in here that makes it so it's not scratchy, but it's a relatively thin chamfer, and so this is still a little bit of a 90-degree angle to push on. And with the PE2, that got thickened out. It's subtly different, but it's about twice as thick. And that's carried over here onto the PE3. It feels even a little bit thicker, but it's probably the same as the PE2, but it's just that nice thicker chamfer that makes this even less scratchy. And so if you are using your fingernail, there is absolutely no scratching whatsoever. This one barely does it. It's the kind of thing where it doesn't feel like it's scratching me up, but if I look at the bottom after doing that, I do see just the tiniest bit of fingernail residue. And on this one, absolutely none. The other thing is with the PE2 is when they introduced, like I said, this jimping at the top and this swedge along the top. And so there was always a micro chamfer. It's not a swedge. There's always a micro chamfer along this top part, but that chamfer just became more pronounced when they added the jimping in for the PE2, and that carries over on the PE3 as well. It looks like it's slightly bigger, but that might just be my eyes fooling me. It is, but it's nice and thick. But the jimping itself has changed and gone even further in the direction that I like. So what is different about these is that the thickness of these crests at the top is just a little bit wider. If we look at these side by side, you can see that the distance from here to here, just like how thick is this, is just slightly thicker. And the reason why I prefer that is because it means that it's even more of a flat surface for you to push on, so it doesn't hurt at all and your fingers don't feel like they're sinking into a big jagged thing. But because you do have the same overall depth, because you do have the same crispness, this is very nice jimping that catches you perfectly well. It just doesn't hurt to push on. And so I think overall, this was already good jimping, but this is like basically perfect jimping. I absolutely love the way it is on this. Now let's move back to the handles. On the PE1 and the PE2, there isn't really any difference in the handles other than that lock bar like I talked about, but I'll just show you real quick. On the PE2, it's not that the show scale has been cut away at all, it's that the bar itself has actually been extended outward. You can see that it flares back out right there, so the bar itself is extending out further. So the fact that he knew that Lockbar Access was something he had to address meant I was really curious what it was going to be like over here. And what we have here is basically recessed show scale. It's the exact same effect where the lock bar is just sticking out compared to this, but because there is no internal lock bar and it's the entire scale over here, it means that the lock scale and the show scale are just at different elevations from each other. But in addition to that, he also added this really nice chamfer. Now, one of the things that has always kind of bugged me about these is even though it's not a 90-degree angle, it's a pretty subtle chamfer that's been added right here. So it feels kind of like a 90-degree angle, and it's a pretty thin lock bar. And so if you are fidgeting with this and doing this over and over again, it can start to kind of feel like you're pushing on something that's kind of thin and slightly still just a 90-degree angle. And so I was really pleased to see just how pleasant this is. The fact that this is the full thickness of the scale here, and the fact that this chamfer is as big as it is, because it's markedly bigger, means that this is a dream to unlock. It is so easy and so comfortable to push this over. And so if you're sitting here and fidgeting with this over and over again, I didn't find that this wore out my thumb at all. I absolutely loved that. While we're talking about that lock bar though, this is one of the things that could be a potential problem for some people. When you have a frame lock, one of the reasons why I like liner locks better than frame locks is because there's no lock bar sensitivity and there's no like accidentally putting your thumb on it when you're trying to open it. So I'm not a lefty person, and so go watch Lefty EDC. He's gotten to check one of these out. Go see if he says there's any real meaningful difference about this lock bar. In terms of from a lefty's perspective, I find left middle finger flicking these knives to be easy, and I can still do it perfectly fine with this one. We'll talk about why that is in a little bit, but the thing about this design, a prominent design feature on all of the variants and even over onto the Vanish, is that he has this notch that's been cut out right here. And on a normal frame lock where you don't have this kind of recession, this lock bar would only be extending directly along this line. You'd probably have a line similar to like that, which means that you would have roughly a third of the handle being the lock bar. On this knife, because he has this cut in here, he has to swerve this back as well, which means now this back line here is really kind of more at the center point of the knife. And so what that means is that it actually could potentially be difficult for people to keep their thumb off of this. The way it's set up right now, even with pressure on this, I can flick out just fine. But if any of the like detent ball geometry changes into production, that could impact, and then it suddenly could become lock bar sensitive. The other place where lock bar sensitivity can be a problem is on front flippers, because sometimes if you're trying to hold it precariously at the front and use your thumb to flick this back like this kind of general motion, it can be sometimes hard to keep your finger off this. And same thing, you can see where my middle finger naturally lands is right there. But this is one of the cases where I actually like having the lock bar relief that a frame lock has on the outside, because I actually find it to be pretty easy for me to instead nestle my finger into that spot and have a pretty firm grip that I don't feel like it's going to fall out and flick back just fine. I'll talk more about why you might want to move this to the inside later, but from this perspective, I actually like having it there. It also means that it's really easy for me to anchor this for a thumb flick. If you watch my videos, I often have difficulty thumb flicking whole knives because I just have a hard time kind of holding onto the knife in a way that allows me to flick my thumb out. But this one, super duper easy. It's even easier than the old ones because this clip is pretty low profile and it's pretty thin and there's no lock bar relief like I talked about. And so I find it kind of hard to feel like I have a secure grip on this. It's fine, but it's just a little bit hard. And over here, I feel like it's super duper easy. Works every single time. So I actually found that thumb flicking this was one of my favorite ways to open that, and that's almost never the case on a knife that I can reverse flick. So for me, on this version especially, all three opening methods, thumb, reverse flick, and top flick, work really, really well and are really, really fun to play with. That is the other place where lock bar pressure might matter, because oftentimes on knives, if you're trying to do this reach over version, you have to anchor the entire knife in this kind of weird way at the back, and it can be difficult to keep your finger off that lock bar. I find on this one that it's not a problem because these are flat slab scales. On scales that are contoured, you can find that you might be like rolling off the edge and it's hard to get a good grip. If you squeeze it, it's kind of squeezing out of your hand. But on a flat slab scale like this, I have no difficulty whatsoever anchoring this in a way that's definitely not going to fly out, and then I can just reach over and pull that back. Now let's continue back and talk about these scales in general. For the first time, like I said, this is full slabs of titanium. There is no liner in there whatsoever. Now that makes sense on the lock side, but that's true on the show side as well. It's just a full slab of titanium. Where that is a slight problem is in weight distribution, because there is no internal milling on this whatsoever. There's no internal milling on these either. And from a weight perspective, I don't find that it really needs it. Like, they're not heavy knives, but they are all slightly above the ounce and inch mark. So on the 3-inch blade, the G10 version came in at 3.22. With micarta, it brings it down to just over 3 ounces, 3.008. So the micarta ends up feeling nice and featherweight, but if there was holes inside those liners, it would feel even lighter. But the real thing is with the balance point, because even on this, with it feeling an ounce and inch mark and everything feeling nice and light, your balance point is all the way back here. This gets even worse on this version. Having these be solid slabs of tie without any kind of lightning pockets inside means that our balance point is at the very, very back of this channel. It's not in the center, it's not at the front, it's certainly not up here. And what that means is that this definitely does feel like a tail heavy knife. It's the kind of thing where it's just you don't quite have as good of a sense of where the tip is compared to the back, because the back just feels like a heavyweight swing. So I would love to see internal skeletonization on here that would bring that balance point up to the tip right here, either where your index finger is there or right in that center point of this part. That's right about where I'd want it to be. Now, at the same time, we'll talk about price when we get to the end, but the skeletonization would definitely add to the price here. So I think that's probably the primary reason why we're not seeing it. Now, from a weight perspective here, though, I said the other ones was 3.2 and 3.0. If you put the tie scales on the PE2, it brings it up to 4.14 ounces. And so it's actually really nice that taking those steel liners out and making it full tie brings this down to 3.4. I know I said a whole bunch of number there, but basically this Framelock version is more than a half an ounce lighter than the PE2 wearing tie scales. Since we were talking about weight, let's talk about carry, because I honestly don't really feel them in my pocket. I find that the tie scale on the steel liner version, this is just heavy enough at 4.145 that I definitely kind of feel this in my pocket. But over here, we're back at a point where it's now kind of invisible from a weight perspective. It is slightly more visible from a clip perspective. The other really big difference that's changed, of course, is that we've gone from QSP's kind of standard bent metal stainless steel clip, that's the negative, fully deep carry, that's the positive, to a milled tie clip. And so from a fitting in with this knife, just looking like it belongs here kind of thing, it just is such a better aesthetic. This, like I said, is QSP's de facto budget clip, and so it's on a lot of their knives. And so having a clip that is unique to this knife, it's kind of generic clip as far as milled tie clips go, but it's finally something that looks like it was made for this knife. And overall, I just think it fits the aesthetic of the knife way better, because it just lines up well. It's a little bit thinner. Everything just looks like it belongs here. Now, I will say I don't notice any wobble on this, but if this were to come slightly loose, it can wobble. So let me show you real quick what I mean. If I loosen this just slightly, by the way, Alt-T8, you can see that it's not an absurdly tight fit in here. And as a result, this can shift to the side. So what I suspect is that, first of all, you can change the orientation of this to make it slightly more straight. On all of his knives, these angle slightly downward, and this came to me at the bottom of this path and pointed slightly down. But if you wanted to make it look slightly more straight, you could. But I do worry that if this does ever become loose on you, that this could start to shift like that. And that is especially noticeable on finishes like this, because it wears a tiny little sharp bright silver streak right there. But we lose the full deep carry of it. Now, it's not bad. We have about that much sticking out of your pocket, but you compare that to over here where you have effectively nothing sticking out of your pocket. And I don't know, that's a trade-off that some people won't want to make. However, another improvement is that it is finally reversible. Now, some people won't consider that an improvement, but it is really nice that you can now get a lefty version of this without having to do an additional modification. Now, he always accommodated lefty people, but he used to do that by offering an upgrade at checkout where he would actually mill a little pocket that looks just like that himself on the left show, what previously would be the show scale. He would do that himself on his own CNC machine, and then he would sell these little tiny tabs that allow you to fill in the other side to make it nice and flush. But now we're getting that directly from the factory, so we've got a little tiny tab right there that is titanium. I think it blends in pretty well, but you do see it, and I think some people, namely righties that don't care whether or not the knife accommodates lefties, would probably prefer to not have that little patch there at all and just be happy to have a righty clip. But I think this is a small price to pay to be able to accommodate that roughly 10% of people who get kind of left behind otherwise. From a carrier's perspective though, the one thing I did find is that, okay, so the clip itself slides in out of the pocket delightfully. It's got great retention, it's got great ramp in both directions, so that worked great. But what I found though is that this lockbar relief consistently caught on my pocket. If you look at where this is touching down, it's right at the top, but slightly further back. What that means is it's not directly against this. It's really bad if the touch point of here is right against the same point as that, but I still consistently found that it would catch on the corner like that. I had to train myself to kind of twist the knife like this as I was going and sliding it in to try and pull that corner back away. I did kind of get it down, but it's still very frequently caught. Not caught in a way that like truly stops, but you can just feel it going which means it is definitely wearing down. The other thing about that is that this is the only point on the knife that is actually kind of sharp. There's these delightful round radiusing along this entire way, and there's delightful chamfers everywhere else. And so the only spot on this that is pointy at all is this. It's not sharp in like a cut you kind of way, because there is the radius right there, and there is a little chamfer. If I can probably, there, got it to glow. A little chamfer right there. But when you come to this corner, it's just like a corner. And so it's just kind of jabby. And so that's the thing that's catching me every single time. I think if they were to make the top of this transition right here be the same kind of radius that you have right here, I think that would also just make it not catch. Because partly what's going on is this is catching up against this like 90-degree angle-ish wall at the edge. So if this was a round off transition in this dimension, it would, I think, just slide right over that. Of course, the other way that you could get around this is by moving this internal. Now, I said earlier when I was talking about how to open it, that I like being able to anchor my finger there. But, of course, it would look cleaner and certainly not catching anything if you moved this inside. Now, I'm going to caution about that in case Jacob says, oh yeah, I'll just flip it inside. In my experience, when OEMs just flip it inside, they keep it in the exact same position and they literally just move it internal. The problem is on knives like this that have any kind of chamfer or radius on the outside, that's limiting how thin you can thin out the lockbar for the lockbar relief itself. Because right now, it's this very thin little material. But if you just inverted this, you would be left with the radius of this chamfer is how thick the material would get. And so if you came out any further than that to make it any thinner, you would end up cutting into the radius itself. And from the top perspective, it would look like it was dipping down. And so typically what happens when people tell an OEM to flip this inside is the lockbar relief becomes thicker and the lockbar becomes stiffer. And that is a bad thing because that means that it's increasing the tension on the blade and opening and closing, which is going to change your detent. It's also going to just make it more pressure as you close the blade itself. It's generally just going to make it a stiffer lockbar, and that sucks. So the two ways you can kind of get around that is if you're going to flip it inside and you're going to make it a little bit thicker, you can then extend the length of the lockbar relief. So it's going to be a longer section of thin material. Or you can extend the entire length of the lockbar itself, and all of that's going to make the entire thing just slightly more flexible. Or, and hopefully this isn't something that Nick cares about, but my friend Nick Rogers from Niche Designs, he showed me the way that he gets around this is by actually having an internal stepping where at the top the lockbar ends at the chamfer. And then once you go inside that, at the back down here where the chamfer would end internally, it thins out even further. And so you only have that additional thickness at the very top. And so that would definitely be my preferred approach, but it's also the most complicated and probably a little bit complicated to explain to an OEM. So let's talk about action, because I was talking about how changing this could stiffen the lockbar. Right now, the way this works, it has a pretty darn light detent. It is lighter than any of the others. Like that's a medium. This is a this is slightly firmer, but medium, and this is full on light. And the reason is because our detent ball engagement is just not that deep. Can I get it to shine in there? It is. Wow, it is really hard for you to see. It's not super shallow, but it's just not all that deep. I think the detent ball itself is just not sticking out all that far. And so the result is that we actually do have moderate tension here. Like, this isn't hard to push over, but it's not nothing. And so as a result, there is pressure pushing down on this as you close this. Now, it's not a lot. This is actually a very low pressure thing here. But one of the things that Jacob talked about he might do is get them to stiffen up the detent. And so I'm worried that they're going to do that by just increasing the lockbar pressure here. What I would want them to do instead is to increase the detent ball engagement and make it sit further in, because that would keep this pressure low, but give you a poppier, harder detent. But honestly, I don't mind it exactly where it is, because on front flipper knives, you kind of want a lighter detent. You still get a nice thwack, but it makes it so you can also just kind of slow roll it if you really wanted to. And you don't ever worry about it flying out of your hand, especially in grips like that. And especially on a middle finger flicking knife, you don't need a firm detent, because you can just fling it and you have the alignment and everything to make it so it opens really, really easily. So I don't mind it in this lockbar, this detent strength at all. In fact, it's quite pleasant. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with this knife is that the opening sound. Oh, I don't know if this is actually going to catch on video. But the fact that this is a super thin hollow grind and then this is a full slab of tie, so it's not transitioning from a liner to a scale, and that scale is not of a material that's going to dampen it, this thing just rings. It resonates in this really delightful way. I suspect it's not going to catch here. I'm going to try and do it by the mic. Whew. And I suspect it's not going to pick up super well, but if you compare the sound of this to, for example, the sound of this one, let's try to do those side by side. Okay. Yeah, at least in person, it is night and day difference. And so it just sounds delightful. I absolutely love the acoustics on this version now. So overall, I don't personally find Framelock to liner lock to be a universal upgrade, just as a truth, but this overall is a definite upgrade to the knife. Now, the price is going up accordingly. But we've got a lot of improvements here. We've got full tie scales. We've got all of the extra milling that has to go in to make this a lock bar here. We've got a milled tie clip. We've got 20 CV blade, and we've got a delightful hollow grind. And you combine all of that, and is it worth the extra money? So I'm not exactly sure how much this is going to cost, because the piece of paper he gave me gives pre-order versus retail pricing, saying this is going to be $179 versus $199. But when I talked to him about when the pre-order would happen, he said he's actually hoping he can do this as a drop rather than as a pre-order. So I don't know if there's going to be pre-order pricing, because normally when people do pre-order pricing, it's they're like incentivizing you to help fund the knife by giving you a slight discount. But if the knife is already funded and it's just a drop, I don't know if there's going to be a difference. But at either way, $179 versus $199, those are no longer budget territory prices, and this is no longer a budget territory knife. And so I think that the price is perfectly in line with where this version has finally ended up. So what I would really like for him to do is keep this as the kind of like premium version. I'd like him to take it even a little bit further and bump this to maybe like $230 or something, whatever it would cost to do the internal skeletonization, and have a true like premium production version. And then also keep this around, because I think there is a very much still a market for a 14C28N stainless steel liner budget version. And I think these two complement each other so well that I think it makes sense to keep the PE2 in production and while doing the PE3, because these are at this point very different iterations of the same general knife. I love both of them, and it's really, really cool to get to see this. I'm definitely going to be picking one up. As far as color profiles go, he's doing the same color profiles for this that he's doing in the Vanish, which we'll get to in just a second. He's doing an all silver version like this that he's calling the Silver Samurai, and he's also doing a black and kind of gold bronze version that he's calling the Killmonger. Now, both of those are references to Marvel characters. Silver Samurai is from the Wolverine storylines, and Killmonger is from the Black Panther franchise. And so it's also just fun that he's outing himself as a huge nerd if somehow you didn't already know that. So there's no drop date yet on this. But let's transition now to talking about the Vanish, because there is a drop date on that. At its surface, the Vanish looks like a variant. It looks like a micro version of the exact same knife. Like if we hold these side by side, it is so obviously a micro version of that knife. But there are some pretty significant differences all around that make this definitely stand out as its own thing. I get why he gave it its own name. What we have here, if you just saw how I opened that, this is now a slip joint knife. We still have the full tie slabs here, and we still have this 20 CV stonewash blade. And so this is a premium knife, but we've got a non-locking. Ooh, do you hear the sound of that? 2 1/8 inch blade, so 2.127-ish basically. There is also no longer a clip, and the knife itself is even thinner. We got 0.388 down from 0.422. So we've got a thinner, smaller knife that is targeted as a 5th pocket knife. And I think it hits that market perfectly. This is to call it the Vanish because it is going to just absolutely disappear into your pocket. It is so compact when closed that, yeah, you are not going to notice this. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with slip joint knives, and so I was really interested to see how much I would like this, how much I would like having that two-handedness. Could I even open this one-handed? I actually was able to open this one-handed, but it felt precarious, and so I'm not going to do it on camera because I think I might cut myself. If you're very used to this kind of pinch and push out motion, maybe you'd be able to do it really easily, but for me, this is definitely a two-hand opener knife. Now, like I said, I'm not super familiar with a bunch of slip joints, so I don't really know how this compares in feel when people talk about the walk and talk, the amount of force it takes to open this versus the amount of force it takes to open that. But what I can tell you is that it feels really, really good. It takes a significant amount of force to open this, and part of the reason for that is because where you're pulling is at the top. A lot of times there will be a nail nick down towards the bottom, and what that does is it increases your lever arm distance. And if I do pinch down here, which is kind of hard to do, oh, I'm definitely not able to do it right now. Yeah, if you do manage to catch down there, it's a little bit easier. But pulling from this spot up here, since your lever arm distance is so much shorter, it takes a fair amount of force to open this up, and you get this really nice kind of click into place. And then from there, you can now pinch further up if you want to, and you get a very nice snap. But on the close is where things get really fun for me. Now, it has a very solid half stop right there. And the big thing is this close right here. Oh, we'll talk about how it's making that noise and why, because this is doing something slightly different from some slip joints in just a moment. But the end result is that this is an easy to close one-handed. It is not going to close on you right there, and so you can keep your finger in this little spot, but it's just a little bit close for some people's comfort, and so I tend to hold it down there when I'm pushing that, and then I pull it out of my way and flick it close that way. From a design aesthetic, one of the things that kind of irked me is that there's now this notch right here. I really liked from the very beginning the fact that the top just kind of follows the line right there and ends in a pretty unobtrusive way. When he extended it up to be a front flipper, he brought it slightly up past it, but it just kind of, again, it all is nice and smooth and seamless. Over here, though, there's this notch, and aesthetically, that just bugs me. Now, I don't like the aesthetic of it, but it's kind of unavoidable because of the way that slip joints work. The only thing he could have done is make the entire handle thicker to just kind of cover it up in this position, because he can't extend this out further this way because that space is being taken up by the back spring itself. The way that a slip joint works, there's a spring steel that's running along the spine of the blade, and that has to come up at least as far as the pivot because it's pushing down against the blade tang at the pivot where it's rotating. What creates these pull effect right here and these half stop stops is that there are flat surfaces cut into the blade tang around the pivot. Let me show you this for a moment. This is not a slip joint. This is a backlock, but it functions basically the exact same way. There is a steel piece that's coming up and extending all the way up to the pivot, and it has a little notch shape like that, that's pressing against a flat surface right there. And that flat surface, because it extends outward, means that the radius from the center here to that corner is longer than from here to the edge of this flat bar. What that means is that if you try to rotate this, it's that larger radius is going to now be in the position of where the spring is and have to push that spring outward, causing resistance. So it's that spring going around a corner there that makes both a backlock and a slip joint stay closed. But that only works if you have the spring pressing against where the pivot is itself. And so as a result, it has to come up this far, and so the blade has to be cut forward to make room for that bar. Now let's keep going talking about how this has, like what makes a slip joint have a half stop. The half stop means that there is a flat surface along there too. So there's a flat surface there to hold it in place when it's closed. There's a flat surface there to hold it in place when it's open. And you can optionally have a flat surface here to hold it in place in this half stop. If you look at something like a Swiss Army knife, this is also a slip joint. It's got the same concept of a pull open, and it's got a snap in the open position. But there is no half stop. There's nothing making it stop midway. And that's because there is no flat surface along the top. There's only the flat surface there and the flat surface there. But this is round this entire top part. So it's going to stay a smooth transition the entire way. Now let's keep extending backward. What makes this sound like this when we close it? Because dang, that's good. Here, let me do that up by the mic. Ho! Okay, what that's coming from is that. Okay, let me point. That right there is a stop pin. And that's something that a lot of slip joints don't have, because technically a slip joint doesn't actually need it. A lot of slip joints will work by just having that flat surface, and it's just in the closed position, the blade will have a slight cut. So this works the exact same way like I said before. And you can see that they've extended this notch downward right here to push against that part. So what's keeping this closed, what's actually hitting when this closes, is that piece of metal right there is hitting against the lock bar. What that means though is that you can subtly push down on this. It's just a little bit springy. And what's happening is that that piece of metal right there is pushing up against the lock bar. And so you can kind of see it, it's pretty darn subtle, but you can see that it's slightly pushing this lock bar out. Same thing's happening here over on my Swiss Army knife. You can ever so slightly push this down, and I think it's going to be even more subtle to see, but if you look very carefully, and if I was able to hold this still enough, you'd be able to see that pushing this down right there is ever so slightly extending that lock bar out. Now, the problem with this kind of flexibility there is that you're pushing the blade down towards the inside of the handle. And on a knife like this, you can see that it's ever so slightly getting closer. The edge of the blade here is getting ever so slightly closer to the inside. And if you don't have a big enough gap, you could technically touch it. Now, I'm not going to name names, but a modern traditional slip joint purveyor of the moment actually had a problem where some of his knives had a flexibility downward that made it so that the blade was able to press against the back in a way that people thought was going to chip their blade, and he actually had to do kind of a recall there. Now that's not going to happen over here, because instead of having a thing protruding down here that's going to hit against the spine, we actually have a cutout, and it's that cutout hitting against this stop pin, which means when this closes, it is completely rock solid. There's no flexibility here whatsoever, because just like on a normal knife, you're hitting against a stop pin. That stop pin has to be very carefully placed, because you still need the blade to close the same distance and have the same alignment so that this is pressing on that flat back. If this accidentally had the stop pin slightly too far forward, then the blade wouldn't close all the way, and this thing would be slightly pushed up still, and you'd be able to feel it. But they did a perfect job on this, and so there is absolutely no transition whatsoever. It's perfectly flush when it's in the closed position. But the bigger thing is because you're hitting against that one little spot, and that spot is anchored into the thing, and it's locked into place, it's a very firm close that echoes and resonates in a different way. If it didn't have that stop pin, it would sound when closing very similar to it does when opening. So there's a nice solid snap here, but it's softer. And the reason is because that's a big flat surface sliding into place against a big flat surface. You're hearing the sound of the lock bar itself click into place against the flat. And that's just not ever going to produce a particularly loud click. But in reverse, you have the blade hitting against the stop pin. And that's happening inside this chamber of titanium slabs, which will make it echo and resonate. And the whole thing is just so loud and authoritative in such a delightful way. It's not loud in a way that's going to like upset people nearby. It's just, it sounds so good to close this. I love it. It's so authoritative. It makes this, it's so much more authoritative than you would expect such a tiny little knife to have. And as a result, opening and closing this has been a delightful experience. I love the way that clicks home. Let's zoom back out and talk more about this. Now, I said there's no clip, and so instead he has a lanyard hole. The idea is that you could probably put this on a keychain, especially if you put some kind of one of those like little beaded chains on there or something, or use a lanyard type material like a paracord to attach it, or so that you can put a lanyard itself on rather than attaching to a keychain and just extend it so that you have a little bit more distance. Because from a grip perspective, this in my hands, I can technically squeeze 4 fingers on this. Actually pretty darn comfortably, but I can definitely see people holding it more like that or just with bigger hands wanting something to curl onto back there. So we do have a lanyard hole for the first time instead of a clip. Another thing we have for the first time is a chamfer. Now on the other ones, there's always been a radius. And so this is a rounded surface as we go along, and this is instead a flat line chamfer. It's a subtle difference, but it actually does look distinctly different if you compare the two side by side, especially as you like rotate. There's like a soft glow this entire way, and on this one there's like a definite transition point where now this entire plane is glowing. Yeah, definitely looks different. But on both of these it's done really, really well with nice transitions everywhere. The workmanship by Qvist is just fantastic. Now, the fact that these are full slabs of titanium and this is a spring steel lock bar means that this is a little bit heavy. It's not heavy for its size. It's not really heavy for anything. It's basically exactly hitting the 1 inch mark. This is a 2.12 inch blade and this is a 2.115 ounce knife. But it just means that it's not absurdly light. Something this size, when you pick it up, you might think that it would be even lighter, and it just has a nice heft to it. But the problem is that that heft is almost entirely at the back. So just like on the big ones, we've got a balance point all the way back here. And so I said the problem, but it doesn't really matter on a knife this size, because the way that a back heavy knife impacts performance is that you lose a sense of where the tip is. But when a knife this small, the tip is just there. It's just right in front of your hand. And especially if you're going to be holding this in a pinch grip like you probably will be, you don't really lose the sense of the tip because you know exactly where the tip of your finger is, and that is where the tip of the blade is. And so in my experience, I was wondering whether or not this would feel back heavy in a problematic way, and the reality is it just never does. This will always, you'll know exactly where you're cutting. So let's finally start talking about cutting performance. So the thing about this blade is that it's just a smaller version of this blade, you know? But that shrinking those dimensions down everywhere is going to make this just cut slightly worse. The blade thickness is technically a little bit thinner. We're going from 0.12 to 0.1175. So this is technically a little bit thinner over here, but it's almost the same blade stock, but the grind is so much shorter. We go from 0.95 to 0.64. And so it's a third shorter of a grind. And what we end up with is just a less aggressive grind to begin with, because whereas this one is coming to 16 thousandths on the PE2, this is coming down to 23 thousandths, which is about the same, but even slightly more than the original PE. So on these two knives, for example, the original PE to this, we've got basically the same blade stock, but a shorter grind and slightly thicker behind the edge, ever so slightly. And the end result is that this is just not going to be anywhere near as much of a laser beam of a knife. It's just a little bit more of a wedge knife. But honestly, it still cuts really, really well. I had all that cardboard to break down, and sure enough, you can hold on to this really easily. It's got a firm enough spring that I never had any reservation that I didn't think it was going to close on me ever. And so I did plenty of pushing right through cardboard, especially if you're holding it like this, where you're not really pushing on the spring anyway. This You can cut through cardboard and slightly heavier tasks like that super, super easily. But a knife this small, and especially a sheep's footy Wharncliffe blade like this is a pretty classic Wharncliffe, but with just enough curve that whatever. This is really a knife that you're going to be cutting like that. Cutting open boxes, cutting on surfaces, and for that kind of small, light duty, cutting on a surface task, it works perfectly and you don't need it to be any thinner. Would it be cool if it was a little laser beam knife? I guess, but I didn't ever notice the geometry of this being a problem for the way I was actually using it, which is almost exclusively this kind of pinch grip, cut on a surface, cut along, cut out kind of stuff, utility cuts. And the fact that this isn't as thick means that I never worried about this tip being bent at all. So it's not like you're going to pry with this, but you certainly can put a little bit more lateral force on that than you can over here on this new PE3 with its ultra thin blade. So this is an interesting knife because it is premium upgrades compared to the original budget stuff, and it is the same kind of premium materials you find here on this new PE3. The price is somewhere in between because it is a small knife and because it is a slip joint. So this is $119 on the pre-order and $149 retail. And for the materials, 20 CV, the craftsmanship, how well this is done, because this is done exceptionally well, all of that feels pretty darn right. I know slip joints aren't going to be for everyone, and I know small knives aren't going to be for everyone, so he's kind of fighting a double-pronged uphill battle, I think. But this is such a dang good small box cuttery knife that I hope people are willing to check it out. Now, I mentioned the word pre-order. There already was a pre-order for this, and it has ended. But there's also a pre-sale and now a Kickstarter as well. I know, that's a lot of different things. And what's the difference between a pre-order and a pre-sale? Basically, Jacob is trying to get this out to as many people as possible. So when he did the pre-order, he was able to fund the knife, but just barely. He wanted to sell even more. He wanted to reach more people where they wanted to go. And since some people like using Kickstarter, he opened up a Kickstarter as well. At the same time, since not everyone likes Kickstarter and some people miss the pre-order, he made them available still on his website as a pre-sale as well. If you ordered in the pre-order, you'll get yours first. That's the main benefit. I think the pricing for all of these pre-versions is the same, but the pre-order people will get theirs first. The pre-sale and Kickstarter people will get theirs immediately after, and then the regular retail sales will go on, and those people will get them last, and they'll be the higher price. I'll have links to all of that down below, and I just wanted to point out that the Kickstarter for this ends December 2nd. So I'm gonna try to get this video up as quickly as I can, but this is gonna give you about a week's notice. So let's bring these all back on the table and say some final farewells. I love this knife so much. I love it enough that I've bought a whole bunch of versions of it. I love that enough that I bought extra scales for it. This is a fantastic utility knife. It was a fantastic budget knife, and now it's a fantastic premium knife with all of the materials and design style and everything to accommodate that new price point. And I think it earns that wholeheartedly. And then this adorable companion is such a dang good fifth pocket knife. It really does vanish into your pocket the way that the name promises, and it's been an absolute delight. So thank you, Jacob, for sending these my way. I'm going to be sending these out to other reviewers. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. And I'll catch you in the follow-up video where I do the swapperoo on all those scales. See you next time.